All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Clean Air Council's virtual Greenfest Philly, presented by Toyota Hybrids. I'm Kamali Alloway, and I'm excited to be here with Robert Routh, one of Clean Air Council's staff attorneys, to talk about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI for short. Greenfest Philly is the area's largest environmental festival, celebrating all things sustainable for the past 15 years. This year, the event is entirely virtual, and we have programming scheduled through this Sunday, September 27th. Check out our full schedule of events at cleanair.org/greenfest, and be sure to RSVP to the Facebook event to get notifications as things are happening. So I will turn it over to Robert.
Thanks, Kamali. Can you hear me okay? Kamali, am I coming through?
Yep, loud and clear.
Nice. Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. As Kamali said, my name is Robert Routh. I'm the Public Policy and Regulatory Attorney for Clean Air Council. My work focuses primarily on statewide policy efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and combat climate change. And this session will highlight Pennsylvania's recent steps to establish a state program to cut carbon pollution from power plants and participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. And later we'll touch on a few other important items in the hopper, but to start, let me just set the table a bit on climate change and the scale of the challenges we face. Basically, why does this matter? So in October of 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released a special report on the impacts of global warming. Among other things, this report highlights the projected differences in planetary impacts between a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming scenario and a 2 degrees warming scenario. The differences are stark, including the complete loss of coral reefs and the fisheries they support, and additional sea level rise that threatens many millions of coastal residents, as well as the very existence of some island nations. Even tenths of a degree difference in warming can have a significant impact on potential future outcomes. So avoiding the 2 degrees Celsius scenario or worse will require, according to the IPCC, quote, rapid and far-reaching efforts to reduce emissions. 45% reduction by 2030 relative to 2010 levels. That's 10 years from now. And to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Now, because emissions from human activity to date have already baked in 1 degree of warming compared to pre-industrial levels, the co-chair of the IPCC working group that authored that report went so far as to say that the next few years are, quote, probably the most important in our history. And a month after that, the United States Global Change Research Program released the 4th National Climate Assessment. This report finds that climate change is no longer a future threat, but that we are already dealing with its impacts as a nation. These impacts range from more extreme wildfires, more frequent, intense, and damaging storms, and changes in temperature and rainfall patterns that cause significant agricultural losses, among other consequences. So that report begins with this statement, which you see on your screen here. Earth's climate is now changing faster than at any point in the history of modern civilization, primarily as a result of human activities. The impacts of global climate change are already being felt in the United States and are projected to intensify in the future. But the severity of future impacts will depend largely on actions taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to the changes that will occur. Now, what does this mean for Pennsylvania? Like every state in the country, Pennsylvania has already begun to experience adverse impacts from climate change. There have been several studies over the years that project what those impacts will look like here in Pennsylvania. Those include studies by the State Department of Environmental Protection, DEP. Those studies are mandated every 3 years by the Pennsylvania Climate Change Act of 2008, US EPA, and the National Conference of State Legislatures. So here are some key findings about what is in store for Pennsylvania if we do nothing. Our climate will be warmer and wetter, with an estimated 3 degrees Celsius temperature increase and 8 to 10% annual average precipitation increase by 2050. Those more frequent heavy rain events will cause frequent flash flooding along inland rivers throughout the state. Landslides will be more common due to the combination of heavier rains and more frequent winter thawing. And higher temperatures generally mean stronger wind events that lead to more power outages. Agricultural production is expected to suffer, with losses expected to be greatest in the corn industry, among Pennsylvania's most important crops. Tidal portions of the Delaware River could rise enough to inundate parts of Penn's Landing in East Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Airport, and nearby neighborhoods during regular high tides. Salt water could move upstream far enough to contaminate major drinking water intakes. There will be rising water temperatures, which make algal blooms on Lake Erie more frequent and severe. These blooms are toxic to both fish and humans. And obviously, human health will be impacted in a variety of ways. Premature deaths due to extreme heat will increase. Ground level ozone or smog levels and pollen counts will increase with higher temperatures, which will exacerbate respiratory problems. New insect-borne diseases are likely to emerge. As winters warm, more ticks become infected with Lyme disease, making humans more susceptible when they go outside. Pennsylvania's downhill ski and snowboard resorts are expected to disappear by mid-century. Again, these are the impacts we are projected to see if we do nothing. Many cities throughout Pennsylvania saw record rainfall in 2018. This had some disastrous consequences, including widespread flash flooding and a weather-related landslide that caused a gas pipeline explosion in Beaver County. Just this month, the Public Utility Commission, PUC, reported that last year, 2019, saw the highest number of severe weather-related power outages in the Commonwealth since record-keeping began. Unfortunately, years like 2018 and 2019 are just a preview of what we will face if we fail to mitigate climate disruption. Because of the past emissions that I mentioned earlier that baked in 1 degree Celsius of warming, some of these impacts are already inevitable and indeed already being felt. But we can, and we must, prevent even worse impacts by avoiding future emissions. So, what is Pennsylvania's role? What's our contribution to climate change? Very quickly, I'm going to see if I can get rid of that little notice at the top there. Not sure about that. What is Pennsylvania's role and our contribution to climate change? Unfortunately, our Commonwealth is a significant emitter of climate disrupting pollution. Right now, we are the second largest fracked gas producing state, the third largest coal producing state, and the biggest net exporter of electricity in the country. We are globally significant polluters, emitting more energy-related carbon pollution in 2015 than all but 23 nations. Pennsylvania is the third largest greenhouse gas emitting state in the US, with DEP estimating roughly 263 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2017. So it is imperative that we do our fair share as a Commonwealth to significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in order to avoid potentially catastrophic levels of climate disruption. We are a large industrial and manufacturing state and have historically been a major fossil fuel state. Where do Pennsylvania's emissions come from? You can sort our emission sources into basically 3 buckets. The electric sector, so that means power plants, the transportation sector, and the industrial sector. So for example, cement manufacturing, iron and steel production, fossil fuels used to heat or cool industrial buildings and equipment. The transportation sector is now the largest emitting sector nationwide, but in Pennsylvania, transportation still trails behind both the industrial and electric sectors. And our electricity generation sector alone emits more carbon than many entire countries, including some you may know, like Greece, Colombia, Sweden, Israel, Singapore, Austria, Peru, and Portugal. So just Pennsylvania power plants alone emit more carbon than those countries. Let me pause here before I go any further and just see if there are any questions on the circumstances we face and the scale of the challenges ahead. I don't know if anybody's put any in the chat. And if not, I will go ahead.
I'm not seeing any in the chat yet, but everybody feel free as Robert's going to put your questions in there, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them.
Yes, I am hoping not to just ramble on for too long without giving people a chance to break in. Okay. And apologies for this little orange square at the top here of my slideshow. I'm not sure what that's about. All right. So one of the most effective policy solutions to begin addressing the problem of greenhouse gas emissions is to put a price on carbon, or carbon equivalent for other greenhouse gases like methane. You may have heard some say that we already have a price on carbon in Pennsylvania and that that price is zero. Polluters in Pennsylvania effectively don't pay for the climate altering pollution that they spew into the atmosphere. But as we just discussed, as a society, we are all certainly paying a price. So early last year, January of 2019, Governor Wolf signed an executive order setting the first ever statewide greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. He looked to the targets outlined in the 2015 Paris Agreement to limit warming to the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. So the goal is to have 26% reduction by 2025 from 2005 levels and an 80% reduction by 2050. Again, designed to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. This is what must be done worldwide. These targets had never been set before in Pennsylvania. It generated certainly some excitement, and it's great to set goals, you know. But then last October, on October 3rd, in a major policy step forward, Governor Wolf signed Executive Order 2019-07, an amended version you see on your screen here, which ordered and directed DEP to develop and present to the Pennsylvania Environmental Quality Board a proposed rulemaking package, so regulations to control carbon dioxide pollution from electric power generators. So that means sources in the electric power sector. These regulations will establish what's called a CO2 budget trading program, and they're authorized by existing state law under the Air Pollution Control Act. Governor Wolf ordered that there be a robust public outreach effort working with the business community, energy producers, energy suppliers, organized labor, and environmental groups as DEP developed this program. And he ordered that the program establish a CO2 budget consistent in stringency to that established in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, so that Pennsylvania could link with other RGGI participating states beginning in 2022. He also ordered DEP to work with the PUC and engage with our regional grid operator, which manages the electricity grid for Pennsylvania and nearly a dozen other states. The regional grid operator, PJM, to promote the integration of this program in a way that preserves orderly and competitive economic dispatch within PJM and minimizes emissions leakage, so that this program is set up in a way where we price carbon in Pennsylvania that doesn't thereby just result in more generation shifting to states without a price on carbon, like currently Ohio and West Virginia. So this was a major commitment to curb emissions, and it has significant policy consequences. And if you've read stories or seen news reports or just come across anything that talks about Pennsylvania's plans to join RGGI, this executive order kicked off that process, and the regulatory process is well underway. But first, what is RGGI? We've mentioned it. What is this? RGGI was the nation's first mandatory cap and invest program for greenhouse gas emissions. RGGI state governors signed an agreement together back in 2005, and the program formally took effect in 2009. So it is a cap and invest or emissions trading program where each of the states involved has set up its own CO2 budget trading program under its respective state law, but the design elements of each state program are similar enough that regulated power plants can trade allowances across state lines and participate in multi-state auctions for carbon allowances. But let me just go ahead and back up further. The fundamental structure of an emissions trading program is that it's a market-based approach to controlling pollution by providing economic incentives for reducing the emissions of pollutants, in this case, carbon dioxide. So each regulated entity, in this case, power plants, and power plants that have a capacity of 25 megawatts or greater, each regulated entity must obtain an allowance. Think of it as almost a permit for each ton of carbon dioxide that it emits annually. The vast majority of CO2 allowances issued by each RGGI state are distributed through quarterly regional allowance auctions. So power plant operators and investors submit bids to obtain necessary allowances at auction, with the market determining the price of the allowance. Those allowances can then be bought and sold in a secondary market. So the holder of an allowance has an item of value, and it allows the holder the privilege to pollute, the privilege to emit pollution into the atmosphere. And the number of allowances available, sometimes called the regional cap or the carbon budget, it declines predictably over time, and that is what helps drive emissions reductions. There are also some design elements. I'll mention a few. The cost containment reserve. That's where RGGI states hold a certain amount of extra allowances outside of the cap in reserve, and those get sold if it turns out at the auctions the allowance prices are too high. There's a predetermined price level where if at auction the price is higher than that, the RGGI states make increase the supply of allowances available because emission reduction costs are higher than they're expected. And on the flip side, starting next year, most of the RGGI states will introduce what's called an emissions containment reserve, where states will withhold allowances from circulation. They'll reduce the supply of allowances available to secure additional emission reductions if the prices at auction fall too low. So the auction determines the price of allowances, but there's also this evolving floor price and ceiling price to ensure costs aren't catastrophically high and that emissions reductions aren't too low. And the proceeds from the auctions are returned to the RGGI states and have primarily been invested in consumer benefit programs. So each state determines how they want to reinvest their share of the proceeds that get generated from participation in RGGI. So these consumer benefit programs include energy efficiency, renewable energy programs, direct energy bill assistance to consumers, and other, broadly speaking, greenhouse gas reduction programs. So again, each state determines how it wants to reinvest its share. RGGI currently has 10 participating states, all of them neighbors of Pennsylvania in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic: Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont. For some context here, Pennsylvania power plants emit more CO2 annually than those in all 10 of those states combined. So if Pennsylvania were to join tomorrow, we would essentially be doubling the size of RGGI. But Virginia will actually become the 11th full participant on January 1st of 2021. Once it does, Virginia will become the new highest emitting state once it links. But still, Pennsylvania's power sector, our emissions are more than 2.5 times greater than Virginia's. So Pennsylvania, it's a big deal, and a major fossil fuel state with very high emissions footprint. So generators have to obtain an allowance for each ton of CO2 they emit. And as far as reinvestments, the RGGI states have generated over $3.6 billion in auction proceeds to date since 2009. Research by a group known as the Analysis Group shows that these investments have created over 44,000 job years. Job year is one job for 1 year. So you generate a single job that lasts for 2 years. That's 2 job years. You get the idea. 44,000 job years in the RGGI region since 2009. And a review by the Acadia Center, a nonprofit, shows that in RGGI's first 10 years, CO2 emissions from RGGI-covered power plants have fallen by 47%. So they've cut carbon emissions nearly in half. That outpaces the rest of the country by 90%. Reductions in other air pollutants from covered sources have resulted in over $5.7 billion in health and productivity benefits by reducing, among other things, asthma attacks, preterm births, and autism cases in children. Electricity prices in the RGGI states have fallen by nearly 6% compared to the rest of the country, where electricity prices have increased by over 8%. And the combined economies of the RGGI states have grown by 47%, outpacing growth in the rest of the country by 31%. That's a lot of data there for you. Those last 2 points in particular about electricity prices and economic growth are really critical because the actual past performance of this program directly contradicts its opponents' loud predictions of economic harm. Pricing carbon pollution corrects a market failure, and in doing so, it leads to innovation and it prevents significant costs associated with pollution. Pause again here just to see if there's any questions about what RGGI is and how it's performed in the 10 participating states so far.
We have a question from Carl. He says, I remember a lot of by 2020 greenhouse gas goals. Not quite sure what happened to them. How likely are the 2025 goals to be met before the deadline, in your opinion?
Well, just speaking for Pennsylvania, with Wolf's executive order last year, he wants a 26% reduction from 2005 levels by 2025. I think if we do nothing, if we continue to stay on the path that we're on, let me go back to this slide here. DEP thinks that we, at least as of 2017, we were approaching that goal in Pennsylvania. I don't have, I'm not sure off the top of my head exactly where global emission reductions currently stand, but in 2017, we're approaching 20% emission reductions from 2005. I'll get into this a bit later. That's almost entirely driven by coal plants retiring and being replaced by cheap fracked gas and gas-fired power plants. We have just an enormous supply of gas under our feet here in Pennsylvania. But those projections, those estimates about emission reductions are based on government inventories, which try to estimate what different emission sources are contributing. There's a lot of evidence that they're consistently underestimating methane emissions. I'll talk later. That's a pretty devastating climate pollutant. Again, this is almost entirely being driven by the electric sector, and industrial and transportation sector emissions are rising. My sense is if we do nothing, we will not meet the targets at all. And in fact, emissions are going to start going up again in Pennsylvania. But with programs like RGGI, there is policy action that can be taken that can realistically see us meet those goals. But again, the idea is to get to net zero as soon as possible, and replacing one fossil fuel with another does not get you to zero. Hopefully that answers.
We have another question from Joe Could Pennsylvania have a cap and trade program without joining RGGI?
Yes, so Pennsylvania already participates in at least 2 cap and trade programs. We, in the mid-90s, participated in National Emissions Trading Program, the Acid Rain Program. We were also part of the Ozone Transport Commission's NOx budget program. Both of these are authorized under the State Air Pollution Control Act. And I will get into a bit later a rulemaking petition draft regulations that were submitted by Clean Air Council last year, along with nearly 200 other co-petitioners that envisioned a cap and trade program even broader and more ambitious than RGGI. So absolutely, yes, Pennsylvania can participate in a cap and trade program without RGGI. RGGI is what's on the table right now.
We have one more question from Jay. How do these goals stack up with the IPCC report from 2018?
So again, the Governor Wolf's executive order committed Pennsylvania to emission reductions that were laid out in the 2015 Paris Agreement. So that preceded the IPCC report, and it is designed, if implemented globally, if met globally, it would, the thinking is that those reduction targets would limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And there are a series of pretty catastrophic impacts that would result from warming at 2 degrees. So what the IPCC report looked to with the 45% reduction by 2030 and net zero by mid-century, that is designed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And again, we are already seeing the impacts from 1 degree Celsius warming. And there's no on-off switch here, really. Every bit of degrees warming that can be avoided will potentially make a big difference. But that's how Wolf's executive order compares to the IPCC report. All right. So I'll just keep on going. Thanks for the questions. These are all great. So I mentioned that Pennsylvania's power sector, the subject of this proposed program, accounts for roughly 1/3 of Pennsylvania's greenhouse gas emissions. And while emissions from our power plants have been trending downward, which I mentioned in response to one of the questions just now, that's resulted from the replacement of coal-fired generation with fracked gas-fired generation. This fuel switching often is promoted as the only climate action that Pennsylvania needs in its power sector. We're already cutting carbon emissions from electric generation, the argument goes, so why is Pennsylvania participation in RGGI necessary? I submit that this is wrong for several reasons. First, the massive increase in gas generation has been driven by hydraulic fracturing, fracking. That's a process that emits significant amounts of methane. Like I mentioned, it's a fast-acting greenhouse gas. It is far more potent than carbon dioxide. It leaks at every stage of the gas production and transportation process, and it is 87 times more efficient than CO2 at trapping atmospheric heat over a 20-year timeline. Lots of independent studies have consistently shown over the years that our government inventories dramatically underestimate the extent of methane leakage from oil and gas sources. But let's set that aside. Set aside the undercounted methane leakage, and even more, set aside the devastating localized environmental and public health harms that are associated with fracking. Setting those aside, big things to table. Gas-fired power plants still emit massive amounts of carbon dioxide, even if it's less than coal plants. Coal to gas switching does not reduce emissions to zero, and as I've mentioned, zero as soon as possible is the goal. Pennsylvania is simply running out of large coal-fired power plants left to retire. We've seen 42 coal-fired generators in Pennsylvania already retire since 2009 without participation in RGGI, and 12 have converted to fracked gas since 2011. That just leaves 5 large coal-fired power plants left. counting on the emissions trends that result from coal to gas switching to simply continue on the same trajectory in Pennsylvania indefinitely, it's a recipe for climate disaster. Pennsylvania can't just rely on market forces to reduce carbon pollution from its power sector, because today's market forces are, in large part, the product of decades of federal and state policies to promote the use of fossil fuels. We need policy action. And the experience of the RGGI participating states has shown the effectiveness of DEP's proposed CO2 budget trading program. It combines declining limits on pollution with market trading mechanisms and the investment of carbon allowances, the investment of the carbon allowance auction proceeds in clean energy. So if Pennsylvania follows through with RGGI participation and reinvests the allowance proceeds in clean energy, energy efficiency, and other carbon pollution abatement projects, here's what DEP projects will be the benefits by 2030. They project a reduction of 112,000 tons of smog-forming nitrogen oxides, 67,000 tons of sulfur dioxide, and 188 million tons of CO2 pollution. 188 million tons. That's the total reduction of CO2 in the RGGI scenario versus the scenario where nothing changes between now and 2030, or there are no policy steps taken. Because CO2 persists in the atmosphere for decades and its effects compound over time, these upfront reductions are really critical. And the health benefits alone of the air pollution reductions I just mentioned, the reduction in NOx and sulfur dioxide, that would add up to about $6.3 billion in health benefits by the end of the decade. DEP also took a look at some of the economic impacts. They project a net increase of over 27,000 jobs. There would be, with increased renewable energy generation, there would be a decrease in power prices, and electric bills can be reduced further by investments in efficiency that reduce consumption. So lower electricity prices, and according to DEP's modeling, that will not compromise Pennsylvania's status as a major electricity exporter. And finally, it will generate from the auction proceeds over $2.3 billion by 2030, over $300 million per year at the start of the program in 2022, which, those dollars can be reinvested in Pennsylvania businesses and communities. DEP's analysis here concludes what most in the generation business already know. By the end of this decade, we will get virtually none of our electricity from coal, regardless of whether we participate in RGGI. Linking to RGGI could potentially impact this phase out, but it would also create a revenue stream of hundreds of millions of dollars per year, a significant portion of which can and should be invested in ways that help diversify local economies and employ workers in areas where power plants retire. Without such an investment program, these workers and communities would be left to fend for themselves when their plants inevitably close, which is what has been happening over the past decade. No single regulation or program in any single geography or economic sector can fully address the problem of climate change in isolation. Just be clear about that. All states, all nations need to do their fair share to reduce emissions that are indisputably driving global temperature rise. It should be obvious that RGGI alone will not fully address Pennsylvania's responsibility in this crisis. Given the Pennsylvania electric sector's large contribution to the problem, the relatively low costs, and the significant health and economic benefits projected to accrue from participation in RGGI, it's the obvious place to start. The electricity sector is the cheapest and easiest sector to decarbonize, and it offers a means by which to decarbonize other sectors. You may have heard the phrase, decarbonize the electric sector and electrify everything. That is an approach. And I should mention, in a major procedural move last week, the Environmental Quality Board, that's the independent state board that adopts and promulgates, moves forward all of DEP's proposed and final form regulations, EQB voted to adopt the proposed CO2 budget trading program. This proposal now moves forward to a public comment period, and there will still be other steps in the state's regulatory process still to follow after that. So after nearly a year, I mentioned Governor Wolf signed the executive order in October. After nearly a year of unprecedented public engagement and stakeholder outreach by DEP, this proposal to significantly curb climate pollution will now be available for public comment. That will allow for more robust feedback and input from all interested parties across the Commonwealth. The proposal is now in the hands of the Office of Attorney General, who will be reviewing it for form and legality. But once that step is completed, a public comment period is expected to open in just a few more weeks. Clean Air Council will be providing tools and resources to the public to make it easy for you to provide comments in support of the rule or to offer recommendations on how to strengthen the rule. We hope that all Pennsylvanians will make your voice heard on this. We know that fossil fuel interests and climate deniers will. They've been making their voice heard pretty loudly thus far. There will also, it's expected that there will be 5 virtual public hearings held on the proposal that will allow residents to offer verbal testimony. That testimony gets transcribed and it's delivered as public comments to DEP. So in the rules supporting documents, DEP is specifically seeking comment on potential approaches for how to implement the program that would address equity and environmental justice concerns here in Pennsylvania. Looking for comment on potential approaches that could assist the transition of workers and communities in a just and equitable way. Again, as Pennsylvania inevitably continues on a path to cleaner electricity generation. And just some other questions to consider for comments. You know, how many carbon allowances should be made available each year? What should the size of the CO2 budget be? How should reinvestment decisions be prioritized? Comments and suggestions on these critical questions will help DEP finalize a strong program heading into 2022. Comments submitted during the comment period will become part of the public record, and the agency, DEP, is required to consider your comments and respond in writing before advancing the final form rule, the final form regulation that will establish this budget trading program. You don't need to be an expert in emissions trading programs or on climate change to voice your opinion and make a difference here. So that was a major step forward last week by EQB, and you will be hearing more from Clean Air Council once we know when the official public comment period is set to open. Again, I'll pause here, see if there have been any more questions thrown into the chat.
We have a question here from RS. Says, this sounds like a no-brainer. What are the opponents saying?
That is a great question. They're saying a lot. I'll mention just some of the more pernicious myths that have circulated about RGGI participation. You may have already heard or read about them. One is that this program constitutes a tax and it requires additional legislative approval. The governor's doing this all on his own, and he doesn't have the authority to do that. So it's a pretty lazy argument you hear thrown around a lot. Anything you dislike is you know, just label it a tax and it'll make people dislike it. Taxes are mandatory and they are used to fund general government programs and services. As I mentioned before, this is not mandatory. The obtaining an allowance is a choice for power plants. They have the choice to instead reduce their pollution. They can emit less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, or obtain an allowance to compensate for the emissions and the pollution that they are creating. And the proceeds, the auction proceeds, under existing state law, again, the Air Pollution Control Act, will go into a segregated, dedicated fund to be used for projects that eliminate air pollution. This will not be used to balance the state's budget sheet every year, as taxes are designed to do for revenue generation. So the Air Pollution Control Act is pretty clear that this budget trading program can be created. The legislature weighed in when they passed the Air Pollution Control Act, and the governor at the time signed it into law. So the legislature does have an important role to play. I don't want to minimize that. They can help, they can pass legislation that helps guide how proceeds from the RGGI program get reinvested. They could choose to set a more ambitious trajectory for the program. Right now, DEP has carbon allowance budgets that they've set forth through the year 2030, but they will revisit the program over the years and decide where to go from there. But the legislature could instead mandate that this program move towards net zero by 2050. Again, they could also, the legislature could make sure that reinvestments are most effectively used to assist with job transition, training. So the focus of the conversation and the effort needs to be on constructive engagement by the legislature, not simply saying this is a tax and burying our heads in the sand and choosing to do nothing about it. Another myth that you've heard thrown around is that that this is a multi-state compact, and if Pennsylvania chooses to participate, we are surrendering our independence and our sovereignty, and other states will be dictating what we do. That's pretty easy to dismiss because just as a factual matter, this is not an interstate compact. Pennsylvania does not have to sign anything in order to participate. The Commonwealth will fully retain its authority and its independence under RGGI. We get to decide how to reinvest the monies we use. In the draft regulation, as it's currently written, Pennsylvania can decide if certain criteria aren't met that they will not submit allowances into the multi-state auction, but will instead just have a Pennsylvania run auction if they want to. Allowing Pennsylvania power plants to trade allowances with entities across state lines just offers more flexibility for them, different pathway for compliance with the program. So it frankly makes sense to offer that to Pennsylvania power plants. But we set the carbon budget for Pennsylvania. We determine whether to participate in the multi-state allowance auctions. We retain the dollars that will be generated and how they will be invested. So, so it's that is one that, you know, Pennsylvania doesn't have the authority to join multi-state compacts without legislative approval. Good news is this is not a multi-state compact. And then you hear talks about how this won't actually reduce emissions. You know, when RGGI was first implemented by the participating states, it was just before the Great Recession hit. So there was a reduction in demand for electricity. There are other examples of again, coal being driven out of the market by cheap gas. So there are other factors here that contribute to emissions reductions that you've seen in RGGI, but there have been a number of studies that show that the framework that RGGI put in place for these states was responsible for driving a good portion of these emission reductions. So that's just one more thing you've heard opponents say is this will impose tons of costs and won't actually provide any benefits in terms of emissions reduction. So you'll see more of those arguments come up during the comment period. So again, we urge everybody who is interested in this presentation and in the facts and figures that have come out from DEP to make your voice heard as well. Sorry, that was a long answer, but there have been opponents have been saying a great many things about potential RGGI participation.
Yeah, we all know that the fossil fuel industry doesn't always care about things being true. So we have some other questions here from Carl. Broadly, what are some advantages, disadvantages of a cap and trade program versus a carbon tax and dividend?
All right. That's a good question. It depends on if you wanted to establish a carbon tax, which would again be unlike a cap and invest program, it would be mandatory, and you could use those tax dollars to fund more programs for just general government services. A carbon tax, it depends on where you set it. It depends on how much you want to disincentivize those entities that are taxed from emitting. So it really all just depends on the level of taxation, and in part you've got that would be a more top-down program where the government has before they set the tax, they'd probably have emission reduction goals in mind and would set the tax accordingly. In this case, you're letting the market, with a cap and invest program, of the market drive emissions reductions, set the price for the allowances, and instead of regulators deciding what plants need to have their emissions reduced, a program like RGGI allows the market to make those determinations. So it's I don't know that there's a right answer, but we've seen cap and invest programs get solid results in terms of emission reductions, and frankly, a carbon tax is just given the demagoguing that has happened for decades now around taxes and what they mean and what people should think about them. It's just I think a heavier policy lift, but it's just a different kind of approach to getting the same goal, which is cutting greenhouse gas emissions.
We have another question. What are some of the things that a company in Pennsylvania would be spending money on to reduce emissions directly, as opposed to availing itself of the allowance?
Sure. So I am not an engineer, but there are new technologies that can be installed on power plants, fossil fuel fired power plants, that can be used to reduce emissions. And then there are some emerging technologies like carbon capture and sequestration that you've heard industry members talk about as a potential way to cut emissions from power plants. But it's just to say, in terms of offering polluters a choice, that there is no, at its core, there is no fundamental right to emit pollution into the atmosphere. And well, given that, there is the sort of operating principle seems to be that the status quo has allowed them to emit without factoring those costs into the bids they submit into wholesale competitive electricity markets, and that should be allowed to continue. And anything that alters that status quo is inherently a tax. Whereas, again, you are there are technologies that I am not sophisticated or knowledgeable enough to really discuss in detail here, but that can be used to reduce emissions from power plants, and that would avoid higher compliance obligations in terms of the number of allowances they'd have to acquire.
We have another question. You may have already mentioned this, but is this just for CO2 and not CO2e?
Yes. So the RGGI program focuses just on carbon dioxide emissions. There are, as I've mentioned, like methane, there are other greenhouse gases that are contributing to climate change. But in terms of direct emissions from point sources like power plants, my understanding is that carbon dioxide is about 99% of the emissions from these plants. So that is the only targeted pollutant, but it is, at least from the electric generation sector, carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas that we're worried about. But it's important to know that there are other greenhouse gases besides carbon that are contributing to climate change, and people often use those terms interchangeably when, like I said, methane is a major problem on the industrial side, and it leaks from the point of extraction from a well site all the way through to it being delivered to a power plant to be burned for generation. But yeah, CO2 is the pollutant we're talking about here with RGGI and Pennsylvania's program. All right, I'm coming up on 10 minutes left here. Thank you for all these great questions. And there was an earlier question about Pennsylvania cap and invest programs, what we could do aside from just RGGI. And I want to return to that just a bit as to close out, because RGGI focuses just on the electric power sector. That covers, as I mentioned, about a third of our overall greenhouse gas emissions. So what about the rest? There are some talks in the work on the transportation side. The 10 RGGI participating states, plus Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, agreed a few years ago to talks with the goal of creating a RGGI-style cap and invest program for transportation sources. Those talks and the anticipated program to come out of it are called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI. We're expecting to see a final memorandum of understanding that will be released by the TCI states sometime this fall. States will seek comment from the public, stakeholders. I believe I last heard they plan to introduce a model rule sometime next year. So TCI would regulate fossil fuels combusted in transportation vehicles. That would affect, as it's currently under consideration, it would affect large oil refining companies like Shell and Exxon that are known as prime suppliers of transportation fuels. So these are large, sophisticated entities that would be covered under the program, not the gas station around the corner that would need to purchase allowances to cover the emissions that result from the combustion of their fuels. So that program may get underway as early as 2022. Each state, like with RGGI, will have to consider whether it's in their interest to participate and then set up under their own respective state laws their program to participate. And the idea is to have these programs be sufficiently similar so that entities can exchange allowances across state lines, which again, it's supposed to be easier for those entities. So that's TCI, but there's still a third bucket, the industrial sector. And that's where Clean Air Council, along with, I mentioned this very briefly earlier, nearly 200 other environmental and business groups, universities, municipalities, and religious organizations, that's where we come in. Under state law, individuals and groups can draft proposed regulations, and submit them to the Environmental Quality Board, that board that moved the draft RGGI rule forward last week. And that triggers a formal process for consideration. So in February of last year, February 2019, Clean Air Council, as the lead petitioner, drafted a comprehensive cap and invest regulation, a couple hundred pages, that would cover emission sources across all of Pennsylvania, including industrial sources. It's an economy-wide program that would impose a uniform cap, and it was designed specifically to bring Pennsylvania to carbon neutrality by mid-century. So the budget of allowances, and in this case, the pollutants targeted would be CO2 equivalent, so it would bring in other greenhouse gases like methane. That budget would decline over time to get to zero by mid-century. That petition was approved for study by the EQB, and DEP is currently doing modeling analysis on it, similar to what it did with the RGGI program. And they're preparing a report that evaluates our proposal. That report will likely come out this year or early next year. And like RGGI participation, our program is authorized by existing law under the State Air Pollution Control Act. It's a similar framework to RGGI and TCI. The design elements were drafted at the time so as to be compatible with existing RGGI regulated sources. We had conservatively estimated a projected, the proceeds to generate from our program just over $1 billion per year in the initial years. So DEP's report that's coming out will make a recommendation to EQB about how it should proceed. You know, does it begin the rulemaking process and potentially adopt our program as it's drafted? Does it amend our regulation in some way? Or potentially they could choose to do nothing. As petitioners, we will have the opportunity to respond to DEP's report, and I'll note there is a potential avenue to seek redress before the courts, depending on what course of action the agency takes. So our petition, it got submitted last year before Governor Wolf's executive order that directed DEP to draft a program to participate in RGGI. These proposals they're on different tracks, they're on different timetables, but we feel they are complementary efforts. They are, the economy-wide program could readily be adapted to integrate with RGGI and with TCI for that matter. And, we could provide, for example, that RGGI allowances, if that program is set up first, as it's likely to be, RGGI allowances could be used to meet compliance obligations for regulated entities in other sectors. So the position is EQB should promulgate the RGGI rulemaking as it is doing, and then go on to adopt our economy-wide petition with some appropriate modifications. But the work has been done, the regulation is drafted, it can be pulled off the shelf by future administrations if need be, but there was a great question earlier about what cap and trade programs Pennsylvania could establish, if not for or in addition to RGGI, and the economy-wide program to get to net zero by 2050 is in the agency's hands. So we will keep everybody informed as that process moves forward, but the next step is DEP getting its report out, analyzing what our program would do. So that is everything I had for this presentation. And if there are any other questions in the last couple minutes, I will try to get to those.
Thanks so much, Robert. That was really informative and interesting. It's always great to learn more about what we can be asking our policymakers to do to combat climate change. And just so everybody knows, we send out action alerts pretty frequently. If you're not signed up for our emails, you can sign up for our emails at cleanair.org, and we can let you know about any comment periods or anything that we need help getting the word out to our elected officials and making your voices heard. So thank you for all of your support. Yeah, Russ just put it in the chat, cleanair.org/action items. So everybody can check that out if you want to take action on RGGI and cap and trade issues. Thanks so much, Robert, and thanks everybody for participating in our virtual Greenfest. We'll have more programming through Sunday. Check it out, cleanair.org/Greenfest.
Thanks for taking the time, everybody.